Wealthy millionaire brings mistress to banquet. What his wife does next leaves him full of regret. Charlotte Lottie Graham adjusted her pearl necklace with practiced precision, her fingers brushing against the cool beads that rested lightly against her collarbone. The pearls had been a gift from Richard, given to her during their 10th wedding anniversary just 2 years ago. He had clasped the necklace around her neck himself, standing behind her as they both admired her reflection in the mirror. "For my perfect wife," he'd said, kissing her shoulder. Tonight, she stood in front of the same mirror in their spacious, tastefully decorated bedroom, but the image looking back at her didn't feel quite so perfect. Her emerald green gown fit her flawlessly, hugging her curves and emphasizing the glow of her smooth, olive-toned skin. Her brown hair, usually worn in soft waves, had been elegantly pinned up, revealing her graceful neck. Lottie was the picture of sophistication and poise, the woman who had spent years cultivating the role of a supportive wife to a man whose success had become their shared identity. But something felt off. The bedroom, though beautiful, felt emptier tonight. The warm golden light from the crystal chandelier above cast a soft glow on the room's neutral palette cream walls, mahogany furniture, and the plush beige carpet. It was a room designed to exude calm and elegance, yet Lottie's heart felt anything but calm. Richard hadn't come home to help her get ready as he used to. No loving kiss on her shoulder, no warm words of admiration as she struggled with her zipper. Instead, he'd texted her hours ago, letting her know he'd meet her at the gala. "Business ran late," the message had read. Simple, curt. It wasn't the first time. As she stepped into her silver heels and reached for her clutch, her mind wandered back to the early days of their marriage. Richard had been charming, ambitious, and fiercely devoted. He'd sweep her off her feet with romantic gestures, a weekend getaway to Paris, a surprise bouquet of roses after a long day. Lottie had been his equal in ambition then, working tirelessly as an interior designer to establish her own career. But when Richard's real estate company, Graham Properties, began to take off, the balance of their lives shifted. Lottie left her career to support his, taking on the role of a partner behind the scenes. She organized events, handled PR, and ensured their home life was a sanctuary where Richard could recharge. Together, they had built an empire, though only one of them was credited for it. At first, Lottie hadn't minded. She was proud of him, proud of what they had accomplished together. But over the years, Richard's gratitude had dimmed, replaced by a quiet entitlement. His attention, once laser-focused on her, began to drift. Late nights at the office turned into unexplained absences. And though she couldn't prove it, Lottie had begun to suspect that she was no longer the only woman occupying his thoughts. Her heels clicked against the polished marble of their entryway as she descended the grand staircase. The chandelier hanging above the foyer cast a cascade of light over her, illuminating her as if she were a queen descending to meet her court. Except tonight, there would be no king waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. The driver, Peter, was already waiting by the door. "Good evening, Mrs. Graham," he said with a respectful nod as he opened the door to the black town car. "Good evening, Peter," she replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence inside her. The car ride to the gala was quiet, save for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional blare of a distant horn. Lottie stared out the window, the lights of the city blurring as they sped past. Her hands rested in her lap, the pearls cool beneath her fingertips. She thought of the speech she had prepared for tonight, one she'd rehearsed in front of the mirror. It was a short acknowledgement of Richard's achievements and a reminder of the partnership that had carried them this far. But would he even care to hear it? The gala venue was breathtaking, as Lottie had expected, a sprawling ballroom with high vaulted ceilings adorned with cascading chandeliers. The walls were lined with mirrors, giving the illusion of endless space, and Tay air was filled with the hum of polite conversation nad clinking glasses. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved gracefully through the crowd, trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres balanced effortlessly in their hands. Lottie stepped inside, immediately greeted by familiar faces, business associates, socialites, and friends of Richard's who all regarded her with the same polite admiration. She smiled, nodded, and exchanged pleasantries, her demeanor flawless. Years of practice had taught her to wear her poise like armor. "Lottie, you look stunning," exclaimed Marianne Bennet, her oldest and closest friend. Marianne, with her fiery red hair and sharp wit, was one of the few people who could see through Lottie's polished exterior. Her gaze lingered a moment too long on Lottie's face. "But something's bothering you, isn't it?" "I'm fine," Lottie replied automatically, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. Marianne arched an eyebrow. "You're always fine. Let me guess, Richard's late again?" Lottie didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Marianne sighed, her expression softening. "You deserve better, you know." "I know," Lottie whispered, her voice almost lost beneath hum of the crowd. "But tonight isn't about me." An hour passed, and Richard still hadn't arrived. Lottie circulated the room, exchanging pleasantries and answering questions about Richard's business ventures with the same rehearsed ease. But beneath her polished smile, a storm brewed. When Richard finally arrived, it was as though time slowed. The room seemed to shift, eyes turning toward the man who commanded attention without trying. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, Richard exuded confidence and charm. But it wasn't his entrance alone that caused the whispers to ripple through the crowd. On his arm was a younger woman, stunning in a ruby-red gown that hugged her like a second skin. Her blonde hair was styled in soft waves, and she smiled at Richard as if he were her world. Lottie felt her chest tighten, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized Isabel Clark, immediately one of Richard's newest hires. The young socialite had been making waves in their circles for months, her ambition as sharp as her stilettos. The whispers grew louder as Lottie watched them approach. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her, waiting to see how the scene would unfold. But years of practice kept her expression neutral, her smile firmly in place. "Charlotte," Richard said, his tone cordial but distant, "you look beautiful tonight." "Thank you," she replied smoothly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. She turned to Isabel, extending a hand. "And you must be Isabel. I've heard so much about you." Isabel took her hand, her grip light but confident. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Graham." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the confrontation that never came. Lottie released Isabel's hand, her smile unwavering. Likewise, as Richard and Isabel moved further into the crowd, Lottie felt Marianne's hand on her arm. "Lottie," she began, her voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," Lottie said again, her voice steadier than she expected. But this time there was steel beneath her words, because while she didn't show it, something inside her had shifted. This wasn't the first time Richard had embarrassed her, but it would be the last. Lottie's heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way through the buzzing gala. Her poise remained impeccable, the faint smile on her lips betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside her. But every step felt heavier, as if the weight of the room's whispers and stolen glances were dragging her down. She could feel their eyes following her, the curious, the pitying, the judgmental. The room was alive with murmured conversations. Lottie knew she was the centerpiece of them all. For years, she had been the perfect hostess, the loyal partner standing quietly by Richard's side. Tonight, she was the woman left in the shadow of his grand entrance with another. Near the bar, Marianne caught up to her, her sharp green eyes scanning Lottie's face with concern. "You don't have to do this," Marianne said quietly, her voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "If you want to leave, I'll go with you. No one would blame you." Lottie paused, her fingers curling around the stem of a champagne flute she had just taken from a passing waiter. The golden liquid inside shimmered under the ballroom's dazzling lights. "Leave," she repeated, her tone calm but laced with something unyielding. That would be letting him win. Marianne arched an eyebrow. "And staying? Is this about proving something to him or to yourself?" Lottie's gaze didn't waver as she turned her eyes toward Richard. He stood across the room, surrounded by a small group of executives and board members. Isabel was at his side, her laughter ringing out like a delicate chime, perfectly timed to every word he said. Lottie felt a pang deep in her chest, but refused to let it show. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and took a deliberate sip of her champagne. "This isn't about him anymore," she said quietly. "It's about me." Marianne studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said softly. "But you don't have to fight this alone." Lottie's smile was faint but genuine. "I know." Across the room, Richard's laughter carried over the crowd. Lottie could see the way he leaned in toward Isabel, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It was a gesture Lottie knew all too well, one that used to be reserved for her. She remembered how it felt warm, reassuring, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. But that bond had been fraying for years, and tonight it felt like it had finally snapped. Lottie turned her back to the scene, her composure cracking for the briefest moment. She set her champagne flute on a nearby table and excused herself from the growing crowd. The grand double doors leading to the outdoor terrace were a welcome escape, and she slipped through them quietly, letting the cool evening air wash over her. The terrace was bathed in the soft glow of string lights, their warm light contrasting with the crisp night. Beyond the ornate wrought-iron railing, the city stretched out in a sea of shimmering lights, alive and endless. Lottie gripped the railing, her fingers cold against the iron, as she took a deep, deep breath. The night air was sharp against her skin, but it cleared her mind. Here, away from the prying eyes and whispered judgments, she could let herself feel. The anger, the humiliation, the deep ache of betrayal, it all rose to the surface, threatening to overwhelm her. But even as the tears pricked her eyes, Lottie refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that tears wouldn't solve anything. She had spent years building a life alongside Richard, only to watch it crumble beneath the weight of his indifference. But if tonight had taught her anything, it was that she couldn't keep holding it together on her own. She heard the soft click of heels against the stone behind her and turned to find Marianne approaching. Her friend's expression was soft, her sharp wit tempered by concern. "Couldn't take the crowd any more?" Marianne asked gently. Lottie let out a bitter laugh. "I couldn't take them any more." Marianne stepped closer, leaning against the railing beside her. "You know, no one would blame you for losing it tonight," she said. "But somehow you're still holding it together. I don't know how you do it." Lottie stared out at the city, her voice quiet but firm. "Because I have to. I can't let him see that he's broken me. Not here. Not like this." Marianne nodded slowly, her respect for Lottie deepening. "What's the plan, then?" Lottie didn't answer immediately. Her mind churned with possibilities, each one sharper and more calculated than the last. For years, she had let Richard take center stage, content to play the role of the supportive wife. But tonight, something had shifted. She wasn't going to let him dictate the terms of her life anymore. She turned to Marianne, her eyes blazing with quiet determination. "The plan is to remind him who he married," she said softly, "and to show him exactly what he's losing." As they re-entered the ballroom, Lottie's presence seemed to ripple through the crowd. Heads turned, and the whispers began again. But this time there was something different in the air. Lottie carried herself with an air of quiet confidence, her head held high and her steps deliberate. She didn't need to confront Richard, not yet. Tonight wasn't about a dramatic scene or a public argument. It was about reclaiming her power, piece by piece, in a way Tart no one could ignore. Marianne watched her from a distance, a small smile playing on her lips. "Show them, Lottie," she whispered under her breath. "Show them all." And as Lottie crossed the room, her emerald gown shimmering under the chandelier's light, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years: strength. The warmth of the ballroom seemed to intensify as the evening unfolded, the soft murmur of conversations growing louder, mingling with bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses. Lottie walked with deliberate grace, her emerald gown swishing faintly with each step. Her back was straight, her chin high, but her heart was pounding in her chest. Tonight wasn't just another gala, it had become a battlefield, and she wasn't leaving without making her presence felt. Richard stood near the center of the room, surrounded by his usual entourage of executives, NAD investors. Isabel, the sparkling accessory on his arm, laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his forearm lightly. It was a calculated move, one meant to convey intimacy without being overt. Lottie recognized the tactic immediately. After all, she had been in Isabel's position once, the charming and supportive partner beside a rising star. But Isabel's charm wasn't the only thing drawing attention. Lottie noticed the way Isabel made subtle comments to the executives, planting seeds of her own ambitions. Lottie's stomach churned. Isabel wasn't just here to flaunt her affair with Richard, she was angling for a bigger role, perhaps even a piece of the empire Lottie had helped build. Lottie took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute. Across the room, she caught Marianne's eye. Her friend gave her a subtle nod, a silent reminder of their earlier conversation on the terrace. Remind him who he married. With that thought, Lottie began her approach. The circle around Richard quieted as Lottie joined them, her presence commanding attention without a word. Richard looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. Isabel stiffened, her confident posture faltering for just a moment before she recovered, offering Lottie a tight-lipped smile. "Darling," Richard said, his voice measured but with a hint of discomfort. "There you are. I was wondering where you'd gone." Lottie smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was mingling," she replied smoothly, her gaze flickering briefly to Isabel. "It's such a wonderful turnout tonight. You've really outdone yourself." Richard cleared his throat, clearly unsure of how to respond. Isabel, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Mrs. Graham, it's lovely to see you again," she said, her tone saccharine. "Richard's told me so much about your impeccable taste. The decor tonight is stunning." Lottie tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "Thank you, Isabel. Though I can't take credit for tonight's decor, Richard handled the arrangements himself this year." The implication hung in the air, subtle but sharp. Isabel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, laughing lightly. "Well, he certainly has an eye for detail. And an eye for many other things, it seems," Lottie said, her tone innocent, but her words pointed. The surrounding executives exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to laugh or excuse themselves. Richard's jaw tightened. "Charlotte," he began, his voice low. "Perhaps we should—" "Oh, don't mind me," Lottie interrupted, her voice light as she raised her glass in a mock toast. "I wouldn't want to steal the spotlight. Tonight is, after all, a celebration of your hard work." She held Richard's gaze, her smile never wavering. For a moment the room felt still, the tension crackling like a live wire. Richard's composure cracked ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge her intentions. As the group began to disperse, Lottie stepped closer to Richard, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You've made your choices clear, Richard," she said softly, her tone calm but laced with steel. "But don't think for a second that I'm going to fade into the background." Richard looked at her, his expression hardening. "This isn't the time or place, Charlotte." "On the contrary," she replied, leaning in slightly. "It's the perfect time. Everyone here sees what you've become, Richard, and soon enough they'll see what I've always been the reason you got here in the first place." Before he could respond, Lottie stepped back, her smile reappearing as she turned to rejoin the crowd. She didn't miss the way Isabel glared at her from across the room, her confidence visibly shaken. For the first time that evening, Lottie felt like she had regained a sliver of control. The night reached its crescendo during the keynote speech. Richard took the stage, his charisma on full display as he addressed the crowd. Lottie stood near the back of the room, watching as he effortlessly commanded the room's attention. Isabel stood nearby, her eyes fixed on Richard with a mix of admiration and possessiveness. But Lottie wasn't focused on Richard's words. She was thinking about her next move. When Richard finished his speech, the crowd erupted in applause. As he stepped down from the stage, Lottie made her way to the microphone. The room fell silent as she stood there, her emerald gown shimmering under the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge not just the success of Graham Properties, but the people behind it, the partnerships, the teamwork, and the sacrifices that have brought us here." Her eyes swept over the crowd, pausing briefly on Richard and Isabel. As someone who has had the privilege of standing beside Richard through this journey, I can tell you that success isn't built in isolation. It's built on trust, collaboration, and a shared vision. The room hung on her every word, the subtext of her speech not lost on anyone. Richard's expression was unreadable, but Isabel's face had gone pale. Lottie smiled, her gaze steady. Here's to building a future that honors those principles together. The applause was thunderous, and as Lottie stepped away from the microphone, she felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in Richard, but in herself. As the evening drew to a close, Lottie stood near the exit, accepting the well-wishes and compliments of the guests. Richard approached her, his expression tense but controlled. "What are you trying to prove, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't need to prove anything," she replied calmly, "but I think you're starting to realize what you've underestimated." Before he could respond, Lottie walked away, her head held high. Tonight was just the beginning. The cracks in Richard's facade had begun to show, and Lottie knew that she held the power to shape what came next. For the first time in years, she felt truly free, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The drive home from the gala was a tense and silent one. The soft hum of the car engine was the only sound filling the space between Lottie and Richard. He sat across from her in the back seat, his jaw clenched as he stared out the window. The city lights flickered against the glass, casting fleeting shadows across his sharp features. Lottie, seated gracefully on the opposite side, held her chin high, her expression calm but unreadable. The champagne she'd sipped earlier lingered faintly on her lips, but she didn't feel the warm buzz it usually brought. Instead, her chest was tight with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Her words at the gala had landed precisely where she intended, but they were only the beginning. The tension in the car grew thicker with each passing moment. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice sharp and low. What the hell was that tonight? Lottie turned her head toward him slowly, her gaze steady. What was what? "You know exactly what I mean," he snapped, his tone biting. "That little speech of yours, what were you trying to accomplish?" She met his glare without flinching. "I was reminding people of the truth, Richard. That Graham Properties didn't rise to the top on your charm alone. Tart, there's more to success than standing in the spotlight." His eyes narrowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "You're playing a dangerous game, Charlotte." She smiled faintly, her composure unwavering. "I could say the same to you." The car pulled into the circular driveway of their sprawling estate, its grand facade illuminated by soft outdoor lighting. Lottie stepped out first, her heels clicking softly against the stone as she made her way inside. The house was immaculate, as always, but tonight it felt colder than usual. The grand chandelier in the foyer cast its golden light on the marble floors, but it did nothing to warm the air between them. Richard followed her inside, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He closed the door behind him with a little more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the vast space. Lottie paused at the base of the staircase, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished banister. "Is there something you'd like to say, Richard?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with steel. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Yes," he said, his voice sharp. "What exactly are you trying to prove, Charlotte? You've always known your place in this, my place." She interrupted, her voice rising just enough to make him stop. Her calm facade cracked slightly, her eyes flashing with indignation. "And what place is that, Richard?" quietly standing in the background while you parade around with someone half my age, smiling through the humiliation while you make a mockery of everything we built together." Richard's face darkened, but he said nothing. Lottie took a step toward him, her gaze unwavering. "You think I haven't noticed the late nights, the excuses, the lies? Do you really believe I'm that blind?" He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. I don't want your excuses, and I don't want your lies. What I want, what I deserve, is respect. And if you can't give me that, then maybe it's time you learned what it feels like to lose everything you've taken for granted." Her words hung in the air, sharp and final. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them crackling with unspoken tension. Finally, Richard let out a bitter laugh, his expression hard. "You think you can take me down, Charlotte, after everything I've done for you?" Lottie's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, Richard," she said softly, "you have no idea what I'm capable of." The next morning, Lottie woke early. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb the empty side where Richard had slept. He hadn't come to bed until late, and she hadn't asked where he had been. Dressed in a silk robe, she padded softly to her home office, a small but elegant room tucked away on the second floor. It was a space she had claimed as her own years ago, filled with books, photographs, and the faint scent of lavender from the candle she always kept on her desk. Sitting down, she opened her laptop and began typing. The night before had solidified her decision. She wasn't going to let Richard continue to take advantage of her. She would act not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. She began drafting emails to lawyers, financial advisors, and key contacts she had quietly maintained over the years. Each email was carefully worded, every step meticulously planned. Later that morning, as Lottie sat at the breakfast table, sipping her tea, Richard entered the room. He was dressed for the office, his tie perfectly knotted and his expression unreadable. For a moment, they said nothing, the tension between them palpable. "Good morning," she said finally, her tone polite but cool. "Morning," he replied, his voice clipped. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "Are you planning to attend the investor meeting tomorrow?" Lottie looked up from her teacup, her gaze steady. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" Richard studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. We need to present a united front." She smiled faintly. "Always." As Richard left for the office, Lottie leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup. She could feel the cracks beneath the surface of their carefully constructed life, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But this time, she wouldn't be the one left in the rubble. The Graham Properties investor meeting was held in the penthouse suite of a luxury hotel downtown, a fitting venue for the empire Richard had built, or, as Lottie often reminded herself, they had built. The towering windows framed the city skyline, a dazzling backdrop for the room filled with men and women in sharp suits, their faces a mix of calculation and confidence. Lottie had attended countless meetings like this in the past, though today the stakes felt different. As she stepped out of the elevator, all eyes turned to her. The emerald green dress she had worn to the gala was gone, replaced by a sleek black suit. Tart hugged her frame in all the right places. Her hair was swept back into an elegant twist, her makeup understated but flawless. She looked every inch the powerful woman she had once aspired to be, and now was determined to reclaim. Mrs. Graham, one of the senior investors, greeted her, extending a hand. "It's been a while since we've had the pleasure of your company." "Too long," Lottie replied with a warm smile, shaking his hand firmly. "I thought it was time I became more involved again." Her words were casual, but the undertone wasn't lost on anyone. Richard, who was already mingling near the far end of the room, glanced up sharply at her entrance. His expression was perfectly controlled, but Lottie could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. Isabel, standing beside him in yet another meticulously chosen gown, tightened her grip on her champagne flute. Lottie's arrival wasn't just unexpected, it was deliberate, and everyone in the room could feel it. As the meeting began, Richard took the lead, presenting a new investment strategy to the group. His voice was steady and authoritative, but Lottie couldn't help noticing the subtle cracks in his confidence. Perhaps it was the pressure of the evening before, or perhaps it was the weight of her presence, a silent reminder he wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. She sat near the center of the table, her posture poised and her expression attentive. She didn't interrupt, didn't challenge him outright. Instead, she waited, biding her time, letting him feel the growing tension in the room. When Richard finished, the investors turned to her. "Mrs. Graham," one of them said, his tone polite but curious. "You mentioned earlier that you wanted to become more involved. Do you have any thoughts on Richard's proposal?" Lottie smiled, the picture of calm. "I think it's a strong plan," she began, her voice measured. "But I believe there are opportunities we're overlooking. For example, the expansion into the mid-tier housing market, something we've discussed before but never fully pursued. It's a segment with enormous potential, particularly given current market trends." Her words hung in the air, nagged for a moment. The room was silent. Then one of the investors nodded thoughtfully. "She's right," he said. "That market is ripe for disruption." Richard's jaw tightened. "It's something we've considered," he said quickly, his tone clipped, "but our focus has been on luxury developments, which align more closely with our brand." "Luxury is important," Lottie agreed, her tone conciliatory. "But diversification is what keeps a company resilient. A single downturn in the high-end market could destabilize everything we've built." "We," she emphasized, her eyes meeting Richard's. The subtle jab wasn't lost on him, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he nodded curtly. "It's something we can explore further." Lottie leaned back in her chair, satisfied. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a move, and on this chessboard, every move mattered. After the meeting, the investors lingered, engaging in quiet conversations as they sipped their drinks. Lottie stayed near the edges of the room, speaking with a few key players she had worked with in the past. Her charm was effortless, her knowledge undeniable. One by one, she reminded them of who she was and why she mattered. Richard approached her as the room began to thin out, his expression carefully neutral. "You've certainly made your presence known," he said, his voice low. "Is that a problem?" she asked, her tone light but pointed. He studied her for a moment, his frustration barely concealed. "You've made your point, Charlotte, but this isn't a game, isn't it?" she replied softly, tilting her head. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks very much like one. And for once, Richard, I'm not content to be a pawn." His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone. Lottie watched him go, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her lips. That evening, Lottie returned home to an empty house. Richard hadn't come back yet, and she suspected he wouldn't for several hours. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, displaying the emails she had drafted earlier in the week. The legal team she had consulted was ready to move forward, and the financial advisors had confirmed that her position within Graham Properties was stronger than even she had realized. For years, Richard had relied on her expertise, her connections, her quiet brilliance, and now all of it was hers to wield. She sipped her wine, her mind racing with possibilities. Tonight's meeting had been a test, and she had passed with flying colors. But there was still work to be done, still battles to fight. Richard may have underestimated her, but Lottie knew she couldn't afford to underestimate him in return. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Marianne. "Saw your performance today. Brilliant. Call me when you're ready to move to the next phase." Lottie smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the screen. She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The game had only just begun, and Lottie was ready to play. The days that followed the investor meeting were a delicate dance. Lottie moved through the polished world of Graham Properties with a quiet, deliberate confidence, her presence rippling through the office like a stone dropped into a still pond. She was careful not to overplay her hand, but each step she took was calculated, each conversation a seed planted. Richard, however, was not as composed. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, his polished exterior showing the faintest cracks. At home, their interactions had become tense and clipped, their conversations carefully avoiding the growing tension between them. But in the office, Richard couldn't ignore her presence or her growing influence. One afternoon, Lottie arrived at the office unannounced, a stack of documents in hand. She strode past the reception desk, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The air in the office seemed to shift as she walked in, heads turning as employees exchanged furtive glances. "Mrs. Graham," the receptionist called out, her voice hesitant. "Do you have an appointment?" Lottie turned, her smile polite but firm. "I don't need one, thank you." She made her way to the executive conference room, where she knew Richard was meeting with Isabel and a handful of senior staff. The door was slightly ajar, and as she approached, she heard Isabel's voice, a low, confident murmur, punctuated by soft laughter. Without hesitation, Lottie pushed the door open and stepped inside. The conversation halted abruptly, all eyes turning to her. Richard's expression darkened, while Isabel's smile faltered, her surprise quickly masked by a thin veneer of confidence. "Charlotte," Richard said, his tone sharp. "What are you doing here?" Lottie raised the stack of documents in her hand. "I thought I'd sit in on today's discussion. I've been reviewing the company's performance reports, and I have a few suggestions." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Isabel glanced at Richard, her carefully composed facade slipping for just a moment. Lottie didn't miss the flicker of unease in her eyes. Richard forced a tight smile. "Of course," he said, his tone strained. "We'd be happy to hear your input." Lottie took a seat at the table, setting the documents down with deliberate precision. She didn't need to say anything else. Her presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power in the room. As the meeting continued, Lottie listened carefully, her gaze steady and her expression unreadable. When Isabel spoke, Lottie's sharp questions and subtle challenges made it clear that she wasn't impressed. Isabel's frustration grew with each passing minute, her confidence eroding under Lottie's calm, calculated scrutiny. Richard, for his part, remained silent, his tension visible in the set of his jaw and the way his hands clenched the edge of the table. He had underestimated Lottie before, but now he was beginning to realize just how much he had to lose. When the meeting finally ended, Lottie gathered her documents and stood, her movements deliberate. "Thank you for your time," she said, her tone cool but courteous. "I'll be in touch with additional recommendations." As she walked out of the room, she felt their eyes on her. Isabel's glare burned into her back, but Lottie didn't look back. She had made her point and the game was far from over. That evening, back at the house, the tension between Lottie and Richard reached its breaking point. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine, when he stormed in, his frustration bubbling over. "What the hell are you doing, Charlotte?" he demanded, his voice low but furious. She turned to face him, her expression calm. "I'm ensuring that Graham Properties remains successful. Isn't that what we both want?" "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "You've made it perfectly clear that this isn't about the company. It's about humiliating me." Lottie's smile was faint, almost sad. "Humiliating you. Richard, you did that to yourself the moment you brought Isabel into our lives." He stepped closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "And what exactly are you trying to achieve, Charlotte? Revenge? Power? What do you want?" Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "What I want," she said quietly, "is for you to understand what you've lost. What we've lost." For a moment, the anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else, regret, perhaps, or the faintest hint of realization. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the hard mask he always wore. "You think you can take me down?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can win? Lottie stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. This isn't about winning, Richard. It's about respect. Something you stopped giving me a long time ago. The silence between them was heavy, the weight of years of love and betrayal pressing down on them both. Finally, Richard turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Lottie standing alone. Later that night, as Lottie sat in her office, she opened her laptop and began drafting the final steps of her plan. The legal team had confirmed that her stake in the company was secure, and the financial advisors had outlined a strategy that would ensure her independence. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of her still felt the ache of what she and Richard had built together, the life they had shared. But that life was gone, eroded by his choices and her silence. Now it was time to take control. As the clock ticked past midnight, Lottie hit send on the final email. The pieces were in place, and there was no turning back. The day began like any other, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Graham estate. But for Lottie, the air carried an electric charge, a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She sat at the breakfast table, her cup of tea untouched, staring at the city skyline through the glass. Today, everything would change. Richard arrived home that afternoon earlier than usual. Lottie was waiting in the study, her usual grace replaced with an air of quiet resolve. The room was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of leather and aged wood, but the tension between them was palpable. "Charlotte," Richard said as he entered, his tone wary, "what's this about?" Lottie stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. She was dressed impeccably, her black dress simple but commanding. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp. "We need to talk." Richard closed the door behind him, leaning against it. "I figured as much. You've been making your moves, showing up at the office, questioning decisions in front of my team. What are you trying to do?" "I'm not trying to do anything, Richard," she replied evenly. "I am doing something. I'm reclaiming what's mine." He scoffed, his jaw tightening. "What's yours?" "Graham Properties was my vision, my hard work." "Our hard work," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his. "Don't stand there and pretend I didn't pour years of my life into building that company. While you were charming investors, I was managing the finances, cultivating partnerships, keeping everything running behind the scenes." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand. "You took that for granted, just like you took me for granted, and then you paraded Isabel around as if I didn't exist, as if I was nothing." His expression hardened. "This is about Isabel, isn't it? You're jealous." "Jealous," she repeated, laughing bitterly. "No, Richard, I'm not jealous. I'm disappointed in you, in myself, for letting it get this far." She moved to the desk, pulling out a folder and placing it on the polished wood. "I've had my lawyers draft the terms of our separation. You'll find everything is fair. I'm not taking more than what I've earned." Richard stared at her, his face paling slightly. "Separation?" "Yes, Richard," she said, her voice steady. "Separation. Separation. I've spent too many years sacrificing my dreams for yours, and I won't do it anymore. I'm done being the silent partner in this marriage." He didn't move, his eyes fixed on the folder. "You think you can just walk away, after everything we've built?" She met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I'm not walking away from what I've built. I'm taking it with me." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of her words finally sinking in. "And what happens to Graham Properties?" he asked, his voice low. "That's up to you," Lottie replied. "You can continue running it, or you can sell. Either way, I'll have my share, and I'll be using it to start something of my own." His lips pressed into a thin line, his frustration evident. But beneath the anger, Lottie saw something else: regret, maybe even fear. "Is this really what you want, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice softer now. "To destroy everything we've built together?" She took a deep breath, her chest tightening. "I'm not destroying anything, Richard. I'm rebuilding myself. And if that means walking away from you, then yes, that's what I want." The conversation ended quietly, with Richard leaving the study without another word. Lottie stayed behind, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as she steadied herself. She had expected to feel triumphant, but instead there was a deep ache in her chest, a reminder of the love they had once shared and the life they had built together. But she didn't waver. She couldn't. This was about more than Richard or their marriage. This was about her finding her voice again, her strength, her identity. Weeks later, Lottie stood in the middle of an airy, sunlit space, the future home of her new business. The building had once been a derelict warehouse, but she saw potential in its exposed brick walls and high ceilings. It would soon become the headquarters of her new venture, a company dedicated to empowering women in business. Marianne walked in, her sharp heels clicking against the concrete floor. "You've done it, Lottie," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "This place is incredible." Lottie turned to her friend, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "It's just the beginning." Marianne handed her a bottle of champagne, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "To new beginnings." Lottie took the bottle, her smile widening. "To resilience, and to never being underestimated again." As she popped the cork, the sound echoed through the empty space, a symbol of freedom and possibility. For tea, first time in years, Lottie felt truly alive. Richard, meanwhile, was left to grapple with the aftermath of his choices. Isabel, frustrated by his growing distance and her inability to hold sway over him, eventually drifted away. Alone in the empty echoes of the life he had once shared with Lottie, Richard began to realize what he had truly lost. But by the time he reached out to apologize, it was too late. Lottie had moved on, not with bitterness, but with strength. She met his apology with grace, but made it clear that her future no longer included him. Months later, as Lottie stood on stage at the launch of her new company, she looked out at the room filled with supporters, partners, and friends. Her heart swelled with pride as she began her speech, her voice strong and clear. "This isn't just a new chapter for me," she said. "It's a reminder that we all have the power to rebuild, to redefine ourselves, and to reclaim our stories. Strength isn't about never falling, it's about rising every time we do." The applause was thunderous, and as Lottie stepped off the stage, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and doubt, but she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more herself than ever before. And for the first time in years, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Charlotte's journey reminds us that strength isn't about never falling, it's about finding the courage to rise again, even when the odds seem impossible. Her resilience and determination turned heartbreak into a powerful new chapter, proving that sometimes the best way to move forward is to let go and reclaim your worth. If this story inspired you or kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss more stories of empowerment, twists, and redemption. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.